Welcome to the podcast. My guest today is a returning guest. We were both regional councillors together from 2010 to 2014. I had the pleasure of working with her at the Grand River Conservation Authority, where she served as chair for 5 years. She's been a pioneer in the local political scene on a number of issues, including daycare, conservation, and the advancement and increase of women elected to political office through the development of the Waterloo Region Women's Municipal Campaign School that has had tremendous success at all political levels in Waterloo Region. She was the founder and first president of the Waterloo Infant Toddler Daycare. She was a trustee of the Waterloo Region District School Board from 1990 to 2000. She represented the City of Waterloo as a regional councillor from 2000 to 2018. Today, I welcome back my friend Jane Mitchell to the Old Grey Mares podcast. Well, welcome back, Jane. I also wanted to say that, looking at your resume online, you've dedicated many hours of your time to not only elected, but volunteer community service.
Yes,
and
yes.
That's what makes you such a good, well-rounded person to talk about various issues, not only what's happened in the past, to learn about what's gone on in Waterloo Region, but to talk about some of the current issues of today, like we're going to touch on with daycare and conservation. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
First, I just want to ask you, how's the novel coming along?
Well, there's a movement forward on the novel front. I have a publisher interested. That doesn't mean anything, of course, but the publisher is interested in reading it right now. So that's really exciting. So I'll keep you up to date on whether that goes through or I start over again,
Right.
The publisher agent. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to getting an opportunity to read your novel someday. So a political intrigue thriller, right? Sort of thing.
Yeah. And also humorous. Yes.
Okay.
Especially if you've been in politics, Rob, you will find it humorous.
Okay, yeah, great. Because it's always, that's sort of what I've always tried to do with the podcast, is give some people an inside the ballpark, so to speak, look at what goes on, so that hopefully they'll have a better understanding from the outside in when they're advocating for issues in the community, what's going on. And that's probably a good segue into
but don't forget the murder. It's a murder mystery, and it's called Bad Counsel. So yeah.
But the podcast hopefully isn't a murder mystery.
No, hopefully not. No.
So just to get an inside look, and really, you've sort of been on both sides of it, because your first foray into local political issues was your advocacy on daycare. Was that be correct?
Yes, it was. Yes.
And
the Ontario Daycare Coalition, yes.
And I was thinking, because in our prior podcast we talked about that, but just to refresh, it seemed to me that you were probably back in, that would have been around late 1980s, early.
Not the 1880s, but yeah, the late 1980s. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, when my daughters were babies, yes, and
back then, were you sort of facing, obviously you're probably facing a predominantly male type of council at the time too, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it was predominantly male when we went to Waterloo Council and asked for playground equipment and got total hostility. But actually it was one of the women on the, not Limosa Groff, but one of the women on the council that was very hostile that we were opening a daycare for infants. Didn't seem to get it why women should be working or why women have to work.
Yeah.
It was a real eye opener for all of us parents that worked, let me tell you.
You mean that reaction in particular?
Yes. Yeah,
because you would expect.
We were asking for daycare equipment. We weren't asking for torture implements or anything.
Yeah. It's sort of like, because when you're a community person, one of the questions that'll come through your mind is, well, how will council react to this? Or what will the local politicians respond to it? And so you're trying to assess that, and you're looking at the people that are around the horseshoe there, whatever council, and you're thinking, okay, well, I must have some allies with these people, and I may have to educate these other people about daycare.
Yeah.
And then you get this total twist. How did you deal with that? Where somebody kind of threw a curve?
Well, we were just turned down, but we just carried on. That was the Waterloo Infant Toddler Daycare, and what happened was my mother mortgaged her home so we could start the daycare, and all the parents chipped in, and the executive director of that time, the head of the daycare, the hired person, actually bought a property on Herb Street, and her husband was a student at the time. And they had the house at the front, and the daycare was at the back, and it was portables. Yeah.
Yeah,
and eventually the federal government paid for us. Yeah.
So you marched on without the local municipal support.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And then later on, I did daycare advocacy at the regional level, and there were people that were very supportive. Lynn Wollstonecroft, Andrew Telegdi, Ken Sealing. There were people, but there were other ones that, you know, I'd sit there and they would say such weird and stupid things. And I was brought up like to respect people in power. That was my background, my English background.
Sure.
And I sat there and I thought to myself, you know, I could do that. I could sit around the table and say stupid things. I hope I haven't. But, you know, and that was my first political awakening was.
Yeah, you could do it. But the one thing I thought was interesting that I wanted to get at was sometimes when we can't get the political support, we have to go and try and see if we can do it on our own in another avenue. And it reminds me,
yes.
when we were advocating in North Dumfries in Ayr for a new arena, yes. We started a group and we basically went out and fundraised over a few years. And I remember I went to council of the day and presented what we were doing. And council, I knew they had rejected the idea with some previous groups that had tried.
Yes, yes.
And so their first question was, what do you want from us? And I knew that there really wasn't the desire to provide anything. So what I said at that time was, we don't want anything. We're just keeping you updated on what we're doing, because my idea was eventually, you know, through education and grassroots advocacy, you get counselors, or you eventually get counselors on board to assist you. And that's sort of like the progress you went through. Yeah.
Yeah. And eventually, I mean, obviously we do have some daycare today, and I think it's gone from a very small amount when in the 1980s to maybe 10 or 11 or 20% of the children are now going to be getting a space. So it hasn't moved forward like it should. Yeah. And the federal and the provincial governments have just not stepped forward like they should. You see in Quebec where they pay $7 a day for their daycare. In Europe, they get daycare for no cost other than the cost of the taxes. And it's considered very important. And it's an issue that just has not moved ahead. I mean, I was advocating in the 80s. There were people in the 60s, there were women advocating for daycare. So we've just gone on. And I just hope that my great-grandchildren will have more of an option than you know, the children today.
I'm going to ask you this question, and I can answer it, but I want to hear from you. With the rise of, look at when I grew up, my mom and dad were both working. I was one of those sort of.
Mine were both working too.
I was a latchkey kid. So I'd come home from school. I had the key. You know, I'm in the house and waited for mom or dad to come back from the factory. When we were younger, I remember going to private daycare, we'll call it, or babysitters, someone that would take care of me. Or my parents had opposite shifts, night shift and day shift, to be able to. One parent was going to be home, but daycare is so crucial to the economy. I want to hear from you why it is that.
Oh, it's extremely crucial to the economy. And I think we're discovering this now, because right now in the pandemic, there are some women that are working at home, but it's very difficult to work at home with your children at home. So a lot of women have quit. And what we're finding is that they are very crucial to the economy. A lot of the people, the nurses, my daughter is a PSW, service people, they're all women. And if women suddenly went on strike and suddenly weren't there anymore, there would be a lot of outcry, because you wouldn't be able to, there's nurses that are women that are doctors. You just would not have the people there to give us the service that we need, because a lot of them are women.
So it's unfortunate that our provincial governments and, whatever stripe, have not made the commitment to the dollars needed to establish the network of daycare facilities to provide that support to women in our communities and the economy.
Yeah, and it's not fair to ask parents to try and get together, or like YMCA to try and stretch themselves to do this, because you've got the problem of you want to pay the people that work for you, the daycare workers, which by the way are all women. You want to pay them what they're worth, but you can't because the cost would be so high that the parents couldn't afford it. So, you know, that's the key problem that you're looking at.
Yeah, well, so let me ask you that. So just going back again, so you guys, your group went off, you created probably an incorporated entity or a not-for-profit corporation.
Yeah, nonprofit, parent run,
And got started, got some federal money, thank goodness. When you became a counselor, what were some of the things, a regional counselor, what were some of the things you were able to do to advance daycare development, we'll say, in Waterloo Region?
Well, with the help of the Ontario government and the federal government, we were able to expand daycares. I mean, the Ontario government then said daycare should be on the sides of schools, which was wonderful. So there was money for that, and the region looked after all of that as far as funneling the money to the nonprofits. And there was extra money came to top up people's salaries, and then the subsidies for parents came in. So if you were a parent that had no money and you were a student, or maybe your spouse was disabled, you would get money so your children could go to daycare and you could work. So that was excellent. We also expanded the home daycare, which a lot of people don't realize that Waterloo Region, and I remember talking to some MPs, local MPs of the conservative stripe that were federal, when I was advocating and saying, you know, that we have home daycare, that, you know, there are children that go and they stay in a home. They aren't in this institutional care thing that they need to be against. Yeah. But you can't have, what I'm trying to say is you have to have the home daycare or the daycare before someone can use it. Like people are talking about choice, and women have no choice. There's a lot of women that just have to work. And I remember when we started the daycare, that there was a woman that came in and joined our group and had her child come to the daycare. And she had a woman coming in to look after her baby. She came home one day and there was her child in a swing seat with poo everywhere, and the woman asleep on the couch. So she did not quit. She had to find a daycare.
Yeah. But let me just go back for a second. So when you're talking about private daycare, and all my girls went through private daycare because we were in AIR, and they're back then. So this would have been in the 2000s, early 2000s. Was no, as you say, institutional or large daycare operation in town. So you relied on neighbors and friends and people who are doing like 4 or 5 children sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and that's where the home daycare and there's a nonprofit home daycare organization as well that hires people. What you get then is you get standards, and certainly my older daughter was in a home daycare when she first went, when she was a baby. She was there, and it was a lovely person, and we actually got her through one of these organizations that because then you've got standards, you've got people checking and so on, so that it's not just, you're not just sort of having someone come in who falls asleep on your couch.
Standards are important, but is that what the region developed, or was that through the region in terms of developing those?
The region developed the home daycare program. Yes. They did that. They didn't do that with me, but they certainly started it before I was on the region, and then they expanded it. They also expanded, and we ended up with 5 municipal daycares.
So I want to ask about that. How did that come about?
That came about, there was the first one, I think, was the one that's named after the only woman mayor in Kitchener. Edith McIntosh was the first one. And that area is what they call a daycare desert, which means there's no other daycares around it. The need was strong. The nonprofits can only spread so far. So the municipality stepped in. Then they built 2 in Cambridge, another one in Cambridge, and then they built the one in Elmira, which has just expanded, which is on the side of a school. And they, and I know we were going to talk about 2015 when they decided to
Yeah, we'll get to that in a
try
second.
and
Just
stop
more on the
them. Yeah,
development, how they came about.
yeah, yeah. But that's how it came about. So over time, those daycares, because everything in the region is unionized, they became unionized. So the women there, and I'm going to say women, there's maybe one man, maybe
You're
the
right.
women there are
Yeah.
paid a living wage
Yes.
because they are unionized.
I was going to ask you
And
about
then
that.
you have a lovely daycare as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask because you mentioned about the government providing additional subsidies and to
Yeah,
boost
but
the wage.
it's not the same. It's not enough. There
Yeah.
is a very small amount that goes out to each, so they're not at minimum wage, but it's a very, very small amount.
So it's
But at least
sort of
it's
like
something.
barely minimum or just above and below a
Yeah,
living wage.
yeah, and maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I got you. So, okay,
Yeah.
so we have these 5 facilities. It's 5, right, that the region was operating?
5, yeah.
Okay, and it's interesting you use that term desert, like they're filling a void
Yes,
in the marketplace,
yes, that's right.
and that would be for because of ease of access. We'll say you're not driving a long
Yeah.
distance to access.
Elmira, that's the only daycare in Elmira. Yeah.
Right. Okay, and the
So
region.
they decided they're not going to close that one. That there was a lot of fuss in Elmira.
We'll get to the fuss stuff in a minute.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't want
Okay.
to jump ahead. So right
Yeah.
now they're all established. And so let's talk about, we'll just pause now on the daycare talk for a second. And I want to talk about the KPMG. And I thought that was a bit of an interesting side story. And this is where you and I actually were on the opposite sides of this issue.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
we were on the same side on discretionary benefits. And I remember early on, tagging along with you and some others in terms of getting discretionary.
And discretionary benefits, by the way, is one of the things that KPMG said could be eliminated because it's discretionary, it's not required. All they did was list what things that weren't required.
But I don't want to jump ahead again.
By the Ontario government for the region to do.
Yeah, I was just pointing out that that's something you and I were on the same side on.
Yes.
The nice thing about municipal politics is, even though some people have party affiliations, federally, provincially, what have you, when we come together at the Horseshoe and debate and decide issues, there's sometimes when we're going to be on the same side of issues, sometimes we're going to be on different sides of issues, but that's okay. You vote.
And it doesn't always follow if they have like a party that they belong to. Yeah. It doesn't always follow either. It doesn't always follow.
And that's the one thing I love about municipal politics. I never really appreciated that until I was actually in the thick of it. And that is absolutely one of the benefits. It's too bad we couldn't eliminate party politics at the provincial and federal level. I think that's sometimes
it would be great. I think it's just that they're so large, because in larger cities, of course, like Toronto or Vancouver, they do actually have like parties. They're not called liberal or conservative.
And you get the unfortunate situation where a member at the provincial or federal level votes their conscience or votes opposite the party line, I'll use air quotes, and they're kicked out of caucus because of it.
Yeah. Well, that's why I never ran for provincial or federal, other than a difficult job. But is because when I was on the council, I could just vote how I felt my constituents or how I felt what we should do.
Exactly. And, I know. And there's a whole bunch of other things that we can get into another time about the joys of being a municipal politician versus being a provincial or federal politician. There's so many benefits to that. But anyway, so back to this then. So I remember when I was taking a look at it, and we're going through the budget every year, and staff was always commenting about how they've reviewed their departments to find efficiencies, which they were doing. But I always felt, because the region was a 1.5 billion with a B dollar entity, that to just leave it to staff to review was probably good. But from time to time, you probably needed an outside service to come in, a third-party audit, because in my line of work as a personal injury lawyer, I deal with insurance companies and defense lawyers, and they were constantly having or telling me stories about third-party auditors that come in to make sure that the insurance companies would send them in to make sure that they were following procedures, being as efficient as possible, et cetera, et cetera. So I know you and I, we were on the opposite sides of this about bringing KPMG in back in 2015.
Because I felt that KPMG would find that the region was doing well, and it was a lot of money to spend on that. And I also had a fear, which of course has now come true, that they would suggest inappropriate things for the region
Right.
to stop and dock, and that
Well,
people would get all excited because it was KPMG and an outside person, and they would go, yeah, let's
but
get rid of.
let's remember this though. They can suggest, like staff can
Yeah,
suggest. It's the politicians that make the decision. And on this issue of daycare, back in 2015, when they did come in, and the vote was, I think,
yeah,
strong to have them come in. It was a strong majority
yeah,
to say bring them in. But when
yeah,
they
yeah,
came in,
yeah.
yeah, when they came in, they looked at a number of things, and I was surprised. I didn't really know this whole daycare situation.
And I was actually on the committee that KPMG, and then they have a
And
committee.
that was fair. I think it was good to have
I
you
was
on
actually
that.
on that committee. I made sure I got on that committee. Yeah.
Yeah, because then you could make sure. I mean, it's good to have the opposite viewpoint, a contrary viewpoint, to make sure that what you're getting is something that's fair and balanced, as we'll say. So when they came back with this suggestion about the daycare back in 2015, well, that didn't fly through council back then. I think the vote was 11-1. I think Sean Strickland was the only one that voted in favor of making that cut.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
why
now,
back in 2015 did that not happen?
well, I think one of the reasons was that instead of, if they were going to sell the daycares, they were going to sell them to nonprofits rather than closing them, which nobody wanted to close the daycares. And what happened is, at that time, I don't know if it's still true, if you sold a business and you had staff, their union went with them. So whoever bought that would be paying for the union wages and the daycare wages and so on. So
you're saying
nobody was really interested in doing that.
So you're saying back in 2015 they couldn't sell it, so they didn't want to do anything with it, or they couldn't just close it?
No, they tried to sell it. The idea was thinking about selling them to a nonprofit, right, to run instead of the region,
Right.
but it didn't fly because it was too expensive to run, right? Because their quality, they're very quality.
Yeah. So I just thought it was because you had so many parents advocating.
And also, secondly, yes, but this time they also had a lot of parents, and they had a lot of parents come and be concerned about it. But also at that time, the daycares were completely full with waiting lists because there was no pandemic. Now there were just 76 children in the daycare, but the thing is, that's because of the pandemic, because you can only have so many children and the parents are at home, or, the situation is that you just can't have the full daycare. But as a lot of the parents said, as soon as the pandemic's over, there's going to be a year-long waiting list. And in fact, there is a year-long
You're suggesting that they looked at the numbers without considering the reason for the numbers and said, oh, well, they're not being fully.
I think at first, yes. They tried to say that they weren't getting I heard that from the counselors, that they weren't getting there weren't enough. And I was like, and I immediately said, that's why my blog was, don't close the daycares in a pandemic, because you don't have proper figures, because people are forced to be at home because their children the schools were closed. The daycares they said, well, there was only 70% capacity in the other daycares. Well, a lot of those daycares are attached to schools.
Sure.
I know with my children, my grandchildren, they are at home because they have seizures. They aren't going to school. 1/4 of their school is not there. Well, how does that affect the before and after for the daycare?
I just want to go back to 2015 for a second. So are you saying it didn't fly because there was the concern about selling it, or why did they just say we're going to close it like they're closing them now?
Because then the parents, first of all, there was long waiting lists everywhere, as there still is and still will be.
Yeah.
And so, and the parents came forward and said, please don't close this. This is why you have disabled children here. We love this daycare. Where are we going to go if you close the daycare? Where do we go? Because there's not enough daycares. And if you close 205 spaces, those spaces are gone. And where are those parents going to go?
Was the issue of wages an issue about what they were paying in those daycares? It seemed to me that you should at least be paying a living wage for people that are taking care of your children.
Yes, you should. You should. But if you sell it to a nonprofit, they literally cannot afford to pay those union wages. They just can't.
And I guess one might say we have a different set of counselors than we had in 2015. Like there's a number of them that are different from 2015.
Yeah, there are. Yes, that's true. That's true.
You know, you're not there, Ken's
yeah.
not there. You know, some different
there.
faces around the horn.
Yeah.
And I guess just they have different philosophies.
Well, you kind of wonder if they do, but it seemed to be that they were very stuck on equity, and they had been, also we have different staff as well, if I may say, from 2015 as well in social services. Okay. And frankly, I wondered where some of this talk was coming from for equity, because they're saying, well, we're the daycare service manager, so we shouldn't be running daycares. It's not fair to all the other nonprofit daycares that we have our own daycares, which I don't even understand.
I don't understand that argument either.
The region looks after old age homes and public health, and yet we have an old age home, and we have, what about the region looks after giving money for housing, and the region has a large amount of social housing. Are they now going to turn around and say, well, we better sell that to all a bunch of nonprofits?
Yeah, that argument's not strong. I understand what you're saying. I mean, what's wrong with the region operating daycare facilities at a level that we would like to see other operations aspire to, like a living wage, right?
And have as we did with Waterloo Infant Toddler, where we had the federal politicians and municipal, provincial politicians come and look at the daycare and say to them, look, I remember we had a whole campaign of, no more bake sales for daycare. There was a whole big thing going on, which still goes on through the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare.
So what you're getting at there is we're struggling to fund this operation, and bake sales are part of it, but we need some steady stream of funding because it's an essential service, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's not enough daycares. There just isn't. There isn't enough daycare. There isn't enough home care. And frankly, the women who my daughter, when she was a baby, and your girls might have gone to, that woman is now working. That woman is no longer doing. I think I know of about two women that do.
Some stay. In fact, the one that I had, she stayed doing it for like 30 years or so. So she.
Yes, there are some, but
daycare. So that was fortunate.
Yeah, but their other jobs come up, and as those jobs come up, they take them. They become PSWs or nurses. Or
right, they do move. That's right, because sometimes it is a struggle. It's a different thing, and they might want a steady job. Because you don't it's not a job that pays benefits or anything. I mean, you want a job with some medical benefits or what have you.
That's right, because the home daycare workers are all contract workers, or they're all running their own business.
Yeah, so, and even those at facilities that are like larger corporate entities may not necessarily be providing benefits to the daycare workers.
Yeah, they might provide like a salary and your basic CPP and EI, but other than that, they just, if they're nonprofit, if they're for profit, it's even less so, but there's very few for profit.
Yeah, but you raise a good point. I mean, this is the problem with a lot of, as you know, because you've been on a number of other social agencies and volunteered with them, and it's a constant struggle for financing. You know, it's like one application after another to a fund that is, and it's not continual funding.
And you spend all your time fundraising.
Yeah.
Instead of, you're trying to do this really good job, if I can say for Hope Spring, this wonderful job, but you're also spending all your time fundraising, trying to get grants, trying to get money to get the operation working, where in BC, their version of Hope Spring is run by the government, and it's a lot bigger and does a lot more things.
Yeah, and people, don't realize the benefit of an organization until it's gone. And sometimes maybe we need to all contribute to keep it going. It's like Social Planning Council in Cambridge and North Dumfries. A couple of years ago, they had to shut their doors.
Yeah, and what a wonderful
organization. They provided a very vital service in terms of providing information and highlighting the issues that are going on in a community to help local municipal leaders, provincial leaders, federal leaders identify the issues and where they should be providing help.
Yeah.
Because a lot of things can happen in your community where people are crying out, but they aren't heard. And that's a difficult thing.
And I think also with the region, they were really stuck on equity, and all this money that went to those daycares being doled out a little bit at a time to all the nonprofits. But what they didn't understand is scarcity is not equity.
Equity was almost a straw man argument, I think. It's just the word went out there and everyone says, oh yeah, we want equity, but I don't think they ever defined what they meant by equity.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the region should be a leader in terms of the services they provide and provide an example for others to aspire to rather than a race to the bottom, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's not as if the region doesn't have the money to do this either.
No, the region
over $1 billion a year.
Fine. Everything was going just fine. I don't think there was a need for that. So, okay, I think we're, listen, that was a good conversation on daycares, and I appreciate you providing us with some information on that and some background. I think it helps highlight some of the issues in the current day discussion that goes on. Now we're going to flip over to GRCA.
Yes.
So let's talk about Grand River Conservation Authority. For people that are listening, just can you give a quick sort of how the GRCA came about?
Okay, so in the 1930s, there was a group of businessmen, conservatives, who came together because the Grand River was in a terrible state. You had all these growing cities along it. In the 1900s, all the trees were cut. There was only 5% of the land was treed. And then everybody's sewage went into the Grand River. Plus the Grand River had a problem then of in the summer, there was very little water. And in the spring and in the fall, depending on the rain, there would be all kinds of flooding.
Okay.
So in 1929, there was a huge flood in Guelph. There was and they got together and they said, we've got to do something about this. We have to improve this river or we can't grow as a community. We can't be a good community where you want to live. You don't want to live with a trickle of sewage going by your house, you know? So
like a lot of things, economics and good business was driving this decision, right? And let's just clarify, not all businessmen are conservatives. There's liberals and NDP as well. So
there's liberals and NDPs in there.
But the issue though was that if they were going to grow their communities in a safe, healthy way, they had to deal with this issue. Yeah.
And they were dealing with, cholera and typhoid, which are all waterborne.
Right.
And the fact that there was floods, there was huge floods. And even up to 1974, there was, of course, you remember the Cambridge flood with the famous picture of the policeman up to his waist in water. So the first thing they did was they built reservoirs, dams and reservoirs, so that the water could come out, so they'd have enough water in the summer and not have so much flooding.
Let me ask you, these reservoirs, were they built after the 1930s when during the 30s, 40s, 50s?
In the 50s. Most of them were built in the 50s. Okay. And then after the 74, I'm not sure which one it was built. I know Guelph was built 50s, 60s. Guelph was built after a huge flood in Guelph. The Guelph Reservoir was built. And and they also did a lot of dams. They also did a lot of diking as well. Right. So you saw after 74, that's why you see those huge dikes on either side of downtown Galt.
Oh, okay. The way it's structured, the way that's structured is to alleviate the flooding issues.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that's why all that is there. And then also at the same time in 1950, was it 1953 or 56, there was Hurricane Hazel. And that is the gold standard for flood mapping still at the moment.
Was that like what they call the 100-year flood?
The 100-year flood, yes. And with climate change, we're going to get more 100-year floods.
Yeah, it seems they've been more frequent, these issues. And a 100-year flood is basically an area on land that they think every 100 years the floodwaters could reach to.
Yes, that's correct. And that's where the flood mapping, and slowly they're changing the flood mapping to be a bit wider because we're realizing that with climate change, we're going, and in fact, this morning was GRCA, they were predicting that there's going to be more rain in the next year than there ever has been, because if you melt the polar caps, surprisingly, some of that water goes up into the atmosphere and comes down as rain in other places. Yeah. So so we're going to be looking. Plus, we've also got this new thing with climate change where it's called I forget what it's actually called, but it's a flood burst. And so you have an area, everywhere around it is fine. There's clouds, and all of a sudden this rain comes down, and there's like millimeters and millimeters that suddenly come down, boom, and you've got flooding. So you
Okay.
have to deal with that as well.
Like a
Yeah.
flash flood.
Flash floods. Yeah.
So in the
Almost.
GRCA area, just so people get an idea of the size, how would you describe how large this area
Okay.
is?
It's as large as PEI. It goes from Dundalk in the north all the way down to Port Maitland in the south. And then there's the tributaries like the Speed and so on that come in as well into the Grand. Those are also part of it. So it looks kind of like a croissant if you saw it on the map.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then that empties out into Lake Erie, I
Lake
guess.
Erie. Lake Erie, and we do have parts of Lake Erie that we look after as well. And Lake Erie is very high. Speaking of flooding, there's been flooding in Lake Erie for a number of years. Yeah.
And when the GRCA first started, funding, where was funding coming from for conservation authority areas where it started? Where was the funding coming for them?
I'm not sure, but by the late 1980s, it was almost all provincial funding that funded the GRCA. And then when Harris came in, the
Mike Harris conservative government.
Not to show my biases, but anyway, when Harris came in, almost all of that funding was cut. And a lot of the staff had to be laid off at the GRCA. And then that's when the municipal levies came in.
So would this have been the Harris cuts?
You got to have money from somewhere.
But just for a sec, the Harris cuts, I mean, that's a fact. It's not a bias. It's just, that's a fact.
No, it's a fact. Yeah.
Yeah. Those cuts were happening, was it, I'm trying to remember now, was it?
In the 90s. Yeah.
Late 90s?
Yeah. I think 90s. Yeah. When Harris first came in. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So when Harris came in and so while he was cutting then, where was that made up?
It was made up through the municipalities. Then the GRCA said to the municipalities, we've got these dams. They're going to, if we don't look after them, you think you've got flooding now, wait till a dam breaks. And then there was also the problem of water quality, right? We have the problem with algae and other different things, water quality. And so the municipalities stepped up and they started the levies.
Okay,
and
so
then now the levies they have to do the levy.
So I just want to ask you then, because you started at the region in 2000, when did you start on GRCA?
I started in GRCA after my first term, so 2003, 2004 is when I was at GRCA.
Every 3 or every 2 years?
They were every 3 years to begin with, so it would have been 2003, 2004, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
After that election, yeah.
Right. So, but that would have been shortly after, still the rippling of the Harris cuts would have been dealt with.
Yes, there were still some, going on, but the GRCA wasn't doing too badly, but I think it's important for people to remember that when you see the conservation areas and you have to pay to go in, that the conservation areas all run on their own monies. Whatever money is raised, that's what they run on. And then the rest is mostly funded by the municipality. So that would be, flood control, dikes, dams, some water quality, and a very, very small amount comes from the province. And that's for grants to, grants for dikes or grants for.
Yeah, so the province still provides an envelope of money.
But it's very small.
Yeah, I know, but it's small and it hasn't increased. It wasn't increasing for years.
No, it's decreased. It's decreased.
So it's gone the other way. But they also provide grants from time to time for special projects.
Yes, but that is still through the WECI program, which has been cut a little bit. But yes, because to fix a dam like Shan Dam or put a new spillway in the Shan Dam is millions of dollars and it has to be done. And we can either ask the municipalities to fund that, which they don't really have the funds, or you can ask the province, which has more funds, to fund it, which they have in the past.
Shan Dam was that Cambridge? Where was that?
Shan Dam is further north. Oh gosh. It's north of Conestoga.
Okay. And that
Conestoga Dam, right? And then there's the Shan Dam sort of further north to that. Yeah, so it's one of the major dams.
Was it difficult to get the municipalities to kick in a share to the operation?
Most of them seem to be very good about it. And now they have to do it. But there's always one or two small ones, particularly in the north, that will complain that we are raising the taxes, raising the levy too much, even though it's 1% or 2%. It's very,
Yeah, I mean,
we'll get things from a council saying, you know, everything is only 1% increase. So we expect you, GRCA, to only have a 1% increase or whatever. And it varies because there's a very complicated way of deciding who pays what. So for instance, the regional municipality of Waterloo has almost 50% of the members and 50% of the land. So they would be paying, say, 2%, but then some little place like Amaranth, which is tiny, would be paying 9%. So they're not happy, but their 9% is maybe $1,000 or something.
Right. I always try to get away from percentages, even with property tax.
I'm just saying, for instance.
Okay, no, I understand what you're saying. I think this is a good point, a little sidebar point for people that don't get hung up on the percentage. Ask what the actual cost is so you know what the real
actual amount are. Yes.
Yeah. It used to be like
what's your actual cost per year?
It used to be like that with property taxes. I would say to people, okay, look, we're at the township, we're going to raise your taxes 5%. And then they'd go, oh, 5%. I said, well, let's look at it. What, you know, if you pay $4,000 in property taxes, 20% comes to the township, that's $800. A 5% increase is $40 for the year. Are you okay with that? And most times they would be fine with it. So it's sort of like,
they should be if they pay $4,000 taxes.
I know, well, that's the point. The dollars, you got to put it in dollars for people to understand a little better than just a percentage. Straight up percentage doesn't tell the whole story. So you got the municipalities now, they're funding things and things are moving along. You, though, became chair, which is a bit of a historic situation, right? Why don't you tell us about that?
It is. I was the first woman chair of the Grand River Conservation Authority. And so that was a nice kind of thing. Yeah. And then I immediately set about having the word chairman changed to chair, which they all, So what happened after that was Joe Farwell was a wonderful CAO.
Yeah, he was the CAO.
He began to promote women into the administration. I take credit for that because we had a great working relationship.
Yes.
And he was very happy. And because what you're doing when you're having women or minorities move ahead is you're looking for the best person. This is what I'm talking about, the best person.
Yep.
Not the best white man, not the best white woman, but the best person.
Yeah.
And so,
You're shattering some glass ceilings.
Yes, we were shattering glass ceilings, so I felt very good about that. And we
now
have voted. There's now the first woman CAO at GRCA. There's a woman chair and the first woman secretary treasurer. So the head table is all women.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I was pleased that I had the opportunity to vote for you 4 of the 5 years there because I was only there until 2014.
Thank you so much. Yes, everybody was very good about voting me back.
You had my vote in spirit in 2015.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So during your time at GRCA, then what were some of the things that you worked on that you were particularly proud about? And we're going to talk about the recent changes shortly, but I just want to talk about some of the things you were doing.
Okay, so the first one is the water management plan, which was, I was really happy about that. And what we did, and it's interesting when you see what's happening now, but in that time, because, you know, it seems to be that they think municipalities don't have a say or something, the present government, but all the municipalities, the reserves, some various farmers organizations and so on, all got together and talked about what they wanted for the GRCA, what they wanted for the river. So they looked at 4 different, and I'm just going to check my notes here, 4 different things. So ensuring water supplies, improving water quality to improve river health, and reduce the impact on Lake Erie, which, as you know, has a lot of problems. Reduce flood damage potential, and build resilience to deal with climate change. And they've been working on that. They've worked on that. It came out in 2014. They've been working on it ever since. Everybody working together voluntarily, not saying you have to do this, but all the municipalities and all the organizations working together to make it better for the river and improve the
this is so important, I think, to remember for those people that maybe think, well, you don't need a conservation authority. You know, step back for a second. When you're talking about flooding, you're talking about water quality, and those sorts of things. Okay, put it in a dollars and cents scenario. What is the potential damage that you would have to deal with if you didn't have something like the GRCA involved to deal with these issues? What is the
Well, if you didn't
cost?
have a GRCA or you didn't have the requirements to not have building on the floodplains, a few years ago, one of our, and it might have been Sam actually, our new CAO, did one of her thesis on comparing an area, I believe it was on the Mississippi, in the Midwest anyway, of the US,
Right.
that had none of these controls, none of these flood controls, none of these development controls,
Right.
and the GRCA. And she discovered that the American place with no controls had billions of dollars.
In losses.
Billions of, yes.
Yeah,
Billions
absolutely.
of problems, yes, because of flooding and water quality, when you think about some of the water quality issues that you hear about. And yes, the fact that if you build in a floodplain, you're going to lose millions and billions of dollars when the flood comes and wrecks the houses.
There are some regulations that are vital and important, some organizations that are vital and important, and people have to open up their eyes and recognize that the cost, it's like that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Do I have that right?
And the other thing is that we're going beyond boundaries. We're going beyond boundaries. So it's not just each little city.
Yes.
Like the GRCA went over to help a river in China. And what they found was each city was its own fiefdom. So that was a problem.
Right.
And if each city has its own fiefdom, you've all got to work together for the good of the river. So if the people in Amaranth aren't happy because they have to pay, but they're above the dams.
Yeah.
People in Brantford that get their water from the river are very happy when the water is good.
Yes.
The people in Cambridge are very happy when they don't get flooded.
Yeah.
So everyone has to work together.
That's right. Water flows over many municipalities. It's the same water, so to speak, and we all have to chip in and help. And so the cost to do that is significantly lower than the cost of rebuilding, repairing, and dealing with damage. And
the cost of the fact that as those business people, well, they were mostly businessmen, discovered is that you can't grow. You aren't going to attract people to your area if you've got a sewer for a river in the middle of it, or you've got constant flooding. People just aren't going to live there.
Let's talk about cost of life, just that. And actually, it reminds me, I was reading this morning about, the situation with water quality on a lot of reserves, native reserves. I mean,
yes.
It's just heartbreaking. And in fact, the article I was reading today was talking about one area where they actually have a new water plant in there. But the issue is getting it operating properly, and
getting someone trained to run it.
Yeah,
you have to when you look at the region of Waterloo and our water purification plants like Mannheim. I've toured through Mannheim a couple of times. That's some sophisticated stuff that's going on there. It costs a lot of money. The people have to be well trained, university trained, and so the thing is, how do you get the clean water, the water that you need, in a simple way or an easier way, and train the people so that they can run their water purification plant?
Take an example, the Kitchener wastewater plant, for example.
Yes.
And the improvement to that, what was the benefit of that?
Yeah, the improvement of the wastewater. Okay, so what happened is at Blair, there was an area where there was 0% of oxygen in the river, 0%. So obviously
a dead zone, right? It's called a dead zone.
Yeah, a dead zone. So Kitchener, and I believe it was the city of Kitchener, not the region, but anyway, they upgraded the wastewater plant and they put in new ways so the water, when it goes into the river, you're not just putting waste into the river or any kind of waste. And that dead zone is now gone. There are now fish and other plants, but that's good, because if you have a place with zero oxygen by Blair, if you live in Brantford, and Brantford always tells us at the GRCA, they're always very much, please, we drink this water, just try and keep it clean.
Right. Well, and trout fishing in the Grand is a pretty world renowned, isn't it? Or fly fishing?
Yep, yep, that's further to the north. Yes, they're internationally North American renowned for the fly fishing of the trout. Now those brown trout are put into the river, but still, you have to have clean water to have trout. And there's also some very good bass fishing, which is what I used to do with my husband.
And of course, when we think about water quality, I mean, it's hard not to think about sometimes the Walkerton situation.
Absolutely.
And, very sad
and you
situation.
wonder how long it's going to be till everybody forgets. And that was originally, because I've actually seen the well, the evil well that was stopped.
Oh, yeah.
And what was happening was the refuge from a farmer's field was coming over to the well. So that's why we have the rural water quality program, to try and help stop that, to help farmers build manure, manure where the manure stays in the concrete. Yeah. And also put in fences to stop cattle going into the river, to put trees. We need more trees. We need more trees anyway, but to put trees along the sides of the rivers and that, because that helps the quality of the water, and so on, trees and bushes and
so the Conservation Authority, I mean, it's easy to make a business case for the importance of the Conservation Authority.
Oh, absolutely.
To our communities. But what is happening? Let's talk about what's happening today with the recent bill from the Conservative government and what they're trying to do. It's this Bill 229 that they've introduced. It's sort of one of these, you always hear, these omnibus bills that come in, and every time you have the word omnibus beside a bill, you might as well say it's ominous. I mean, it's just there's always
Schedule 6 is the problem, and we were talking about that because
it's just so clear. Schedule 6, and what is that? That's like a schedule attached to the
bill, yeah.
To the conservation bill.
Okay. Yeah.
And what was Schedule 6 about?
Well, what happened was there was a Conservation Authorities Act under the previous government, which actually one of the things that I did do along with the Water Management Plan was I made sure that GRCA and Conservation Ontario were able to talk to the ministers through AMO and through other areas. So we had a really good conversations, and that act came through, and it was very good, because there's always been a worry that there's a group in Eastern Ontario that wants to get rid of conservation authorities altogether. Whether they had a problem with their conservation authorities or what, I don't know. So Grand River Conservation Authority has to talk to the government of the day and say, look, we're really good. This is how you can do it, and this is how we should. But what happened here in this Schedule 6, there's a number of things in it, but it's mostly the problems are with permits and permitting, and the fact that the GRCA will say you cannot build here, or you cannot develop here or put fill here, because it is going to affect the river. It's a wetland. Wetlands help the quality of water in the river, and so on.
Wetlands help purify water, correct? I mean,
yes, that's correct. If you ever talk to someone who still thinks of them as swamps, it's a very interesting conversation. But so with Schedule 6, what's basically the big problem is that the minister can now say, even if the GRCA turns down a permit, they can say that the GRCA has to have that permit. Has to have that permit, give that permit to the developer. If the developer goes to the minister and the minister decides that yes, they can build or whatever. It came out of a problem, I don't know if it was a problem, but in Toronto, where a developer wanted to build a warehouse and a movie theater on a provincial wetland. And the GRC, the Toronto Conservation Authority turned them down. So they went to their buddies in the government and were very angry. Wow. So now the minister can just say, oh, sorry, you just can build on there. You can drain that wetland and build on there. So this morning we were a bit worried, because what it could mean is, say someone wants to build an apartment building in the floodplain. Right. And the minister decides that's a good idea. And as we were talking before yesterday, there's always people saying, well, it's never flooded in this area before, right, so we should be able to build. Well, yeah, maybe not since Hurricane Hazel it hasn't, but with climate change, you're going to get more flooding. So what happened? We were talking about liability, because members were saying, well, what if they built this apartment building and a flood came and there's cracks or it fell down, or who does the liability? So we were saying, well, we'll say the province, because the province,
but so what's happening though is the province is overriding the building planning
science
locally, and the science as well.
Yes. And
it's interesting with the cinema, they could show Anthropocene there. The irony of watching that in the cinema that's built in the floodplain area.
It's
conservation practices.
But there's still going to be a working group and some other public input and stuff with the regulations. So we'll keep on working away at it, and hopefully the government will come to see that what they're doing is probably not a good idea. As I said to you, the other thing is, of course, a minister can change and a government can change, and maybe one day you'll have a Green Party member as the minister. And
well, that's just, you know what, that segues into a good wrap up for this. Just like with the daycare decision, where we had some changes in the elected officials who from 2015 to 2020 made a different decision. It's possible through continued advocacy, political advocacy, recognizing that elections are important and you should help out and put in candidates that reflect the views that you want.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be by party. There's been conservative governments that have been.
Right, but to get the people, well, it's probably going to have to be by party if it's going to change.
Yes, I know it's going to have to be by party.
Unless you get the party to accept a new policy platform. But even then, it's going to have to be the leadership and the elected members to change in order to get the change you want. And so hopefully that'll happen with respect to these changes on conservation. So
and environment and climate change generally, because it's every year it gets worse, and there's a whole lot of people talking about pandemics and climate change and how,
well, if you said, look at the Arctic and what's happening to the ice cap.
It's just, and I remember going it must have been the 90s. I remember going to a conference, and there was a person there from the Arctic, and this was in, I think, the 80s or 90s. And she was saying then that they were having problems. Way back in the 80s and 90s, we knew climate change was coming. We knew it was happening, and nothing was done.
Until it inconveniences you, you don't do anything about it. Jane, let me just ask you, are you still involved with the GRCA today?
Oh, yes, I'm a member. Yes, I'm still a member. Yes, I'm a non-elected member, which is just the same as a member. Yes.
So you're staying active.
I go to the meetings every month. Yes, I'm still active. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, see, there you go.
I have that until the next election. So
I mean, your dedication and commitment to the community continues, and it's clear in our conversation today the impact you've had, and I look forward to watching the impact you'll continue to have.
And now that you have your podcast, and I'm ramping up my blog. So which I've had for many years. So
let's get the word out there, and I can hardly wait to read your book. So Jane, listen, thanks again.
So hopefully keep your fingers crossed that this publisher really likes it. The reader's name is Ed, and they said they were quite dismayed to find that the first sentence of the book was Ed was dead. So
Ed was dead. I'm glad it didn't say Rob was dead. Anyway.
No, it didn't say Rob was dead. No, I try and keep the actual names of actual politicians I've known out of the book and give them a different name. Yeah.
We'll try and tell by the description. But anyway, you take care, Jane. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Okay, you take care. Yeah, bye-bye. Have a good day.
So this has been another edition of the Old Grey Mares podcast. I want to thank you for having listened and tagged along with us. If you want to hear from someone in the community that you think would be an excellent guest for this podcast, let me know, and we will be happy to try and make that happen. And if you really like what you hear, you can subscribe and be informed of future Old Grey Mare podcasts. Thanks again. All the best.